white wolf's amber eyes locked onto Noah Sinclair from the edge of a 40-meter cliff. Below, a river of snowmelt thundered through the canyon, swallowing everything in its path. The mist rising off the water soaked Noah's jacket as he hung suspended on the rope close enough to see the animal's chest heaving with each shallow breath. The wolf did not look away. Neither did he. Every Parks Canada ranger in Nunavut knew that approaching a wild Arctic wolf on open ground was dangerous enough. Doing it on a crumbling rock ledge above a flash flood with 1 hour before the outcrop gave way entirely was something no training manual had ever covered. The wolf's left shoulder sat wrong, strained compensating, and his white coat was soaked through with runoff from the cliff face. He had been on that ledge for over 2 hours. He was exhausted, frightened, and completely alone. What happened in the next 60 minutes would leave the entire station in tears. It started the way most disasters do in the Arctic, quietly and without warning. The spring of that year came 3 weeks early to the Nunavut Highlands. By mid-April, temperatures that should have held at -20 were pushing above freezing by midday. The snowpack that had built up over 7 months of polar winter began to release all at once. Rivers that had been locked under 2 feet of ice since October cracked open overnight. Valleys that were silent in the morning were roaring by afternoon. The landscape was shedding itself, and anything caught in the wrong place at the wrong time had no second chance. Alpha had been ranging that valley for 4 years. He was 9 years old, 45 kilograms of muscle and bone, wrapped in a coat so white it vanished against fresh snow. A scar ran along his left cheek from a territorial fight 3 winters back, the kind of wound that healed clean but left a mark. He was the breeding male of a pack of 7, and he had crossed that particular stretch of highland dozens of times, hunting caribou along the eastern ridge where the herd came through each spring. He knew the terrain the way an animal knows anything, not as a map, but as a body. The angle of a slope, the sound ice makes before it moves, the smell of water under pressure. But that morning the melt came faster than any of it. Alpha had pushed ahead of the pack in pursuit of a caribou calf that had broken from the herd and veered toward the canyon. He was close 20 meters, then 15 when the sound came. Not a crack, not a rumble, but a low, tearing roar that seemed to rise from the ground itself. The snowpack on the upper ridge had destabilized in the night, and now it was moving. A wall of slush and ice and debris, 3 meters high, swept down the valley floor in seconds, filling the canyon corridor with a force that flattened everything at ground level. The pack scattered upslope and survived. Alpha was already too far into the canyon. The surge caught him on his left flank and drove him sideways into the cliff face. He scrambled for purchase on the rock claws, scraping against wet stone, and found a ledge narrow, barely a meter wide, jutting out from the sheer face 40 meters above the canyon floor. He pulled himself onto it and held still while the flood passed beneath him. When the roar faded to a steady rushing current, he was alive. But the ledge was an island. The rock below was vertical and slick with runoff. The rock above overhung in a way that offered nothing to grip. He had nowhere to go. He stood on that ledge and called for his pack. The howl carried across the highlands, long and searching. No answer came back. The pack had scattered too far, and the noise of the melt drowned everything. He called again, then he stopped, lowered himself onto his belly, and waited in the way that wild animals wait. Completely still, conserving heat and energy, reading every shift in the air for information. 40 kilometers away, at the Parks Canada monitoring station on the Western Plateau, a motion-triggered camera mounted on the canyon ridge captured a single frame at 6:47 in the morning. It showed a white shape on a dark rock face, small against the cliff, motionless. A wildlife technician named Carla spotted it on the morning review and pulled the image up on her screen. She stared at it for a long moment, then walked directly to Noah Sinclair's office without knocking. Noah had been a Parks Canada ranger for 14 years, the last 6 of them stationed in Nunavut. He was 38 years old, lean and unhurried in the way that people become when they have spent enough time in places where panic is a liability. He looked at the image on Carla's tablet for about 5 seconds before he picked up the radio and called Dr. Ben Hartley at the Northern Veterinary Response Unit. Ben was 51, a wildlife veterinarian who had spent 2 decades working emergency response across the Canadian Arctic. He had treated injured muskoxen, sedated polar bears for collar fitting, and once kept a beluga whale calm for 6 hours while a rescue team worked in freezing water. He was not easily unsettled. When Noah described what he was looking at, Ben was quiet for a moment, then confirmed he would meet him at the helipad in 20 minutes. They were in the air by 8. The canyon came into view 17 minutes later. From above, the scale of the flood damage was striking. The valley floor was buried under a moving sheet of gray slush debris from the upper ridge, still tumbling down in slow cascades along the walls. And there, on a ledge, 2/3 of the way up the eastern face, was Alpha. White fur against gray rock. Still alive, still waiting. The pilot circled twice to assess the situation. The ledge was too narrow for any kind of landing approach. The cliff face was wet and unstable. The snowmelt roaring below made rope extraction from the base impossible. The only viable approach was from above, rappelling down the cliff face from the ridge, reaching the ledge from overhead, and somehow securing the animal for a vertical extraction. Ben ran through the sedation variables in his head. Weight estimate, stress level, the risk of a sedated animal going limp on a narrow ledge 40 meters above a flash flood. Nothing about it was straightforward. Noah had already put on his harness. The helicopter set down on the ridge above the canyon at 8:41 in the morning. Noah checked his rigging twice, anchored the main line to a rock formation that Ben and the pilot confirmed was solid, and walked to the edge. From up here, the ledge was a thin gray stripe on the cliff face, and Alpha was a white smudge at its center. The roar of the water below was constant and physical. Something felt in the sternum as much as heard. He went over the edge. The descent took 11 minutes. The rock face was uneven and wet, and he moved carefully, testing each placement before committing his weight. At 30 meters, he could see Alpha clearly. The wolf had pulled himself into a crouch, ears flat, tracking every movement on the rope above him. At 25 meters, the animal rose to his feet. At 20 meters, he began to vocalize. Low, sustained growls that vibrated up through the cliff and into the rope. Noah stopped descending and held position, swinging slightly, letting the wolf see him clearly and completely. Not a threat approaching fast, just a shape, hanging still in the gray morning air. He stayed there for 4 minutes without moving. The growling did not stop, but it changed, became less continuous. The wolf's ears shifted, still flat, but no longer pinned hard against his skull. Noah read it the way 14 years of fieldwork had taught him to read animals, not with certainty, but with attention. He began to descend again, slower than before. 1 meter, stop. 2 meters, stop. He was not trying to reach the ledge quickly. He was trying to arrive in a way the wolf could accept. At 15 meters, he was close enough to see the animal's ribs working hard with each breath. Close enough to see the left shoulder sitting slightly wrong, not broken, but strained, the leg bearing less weight than the right. Close enough to see the amber eyes tracking him with an intensity that was not aggression anymore. It was something more complicated than aggression. The eyes of an animal that was exhausted and frightened and had been alone on a rock face for over 2 hours, and was now watching the only moving thing in its world with something that might, in another context, have been called attention. Noah descended to ledge level and stopped. He was 2 meters to the wolf's left, hanging on the rope feet, braced lightly against the cliff face. They were eye to eye. Neither moved. He began to talk. Not words with meaning, not commands, just sound. Low and even and continuous, the kind of tone that carries no urgency and no threat. He had done this with injured foxes and distressed caribou calves, and once with a black bear that had fallen through river ice, and he had learned that the content mattered less than the consistency. Predictable sound from a stationary source. Something to orient to that was not the wind or the water below. Alpha watched him without blinking. The growling had stopped entirely now. The wolf's body was still coiled, ready to move in any direction the narrow ledge allowed. But the readiness had shifted from offensive to defensive. He was not preparing to attack. He was waiting to see what this strange hanging creature was going to do next. Noah kept talking. He shifted his weight incrementally on the rope, letting the wolf track the small movements without surprise. After another 6 minutes, Alpha lowered his head by a few centimeters. It was a small thing. It was everything. The extraction itself took another 22 minutes. Noah worked one-handed, keeping his voice going while he freed the heavy canvas wrap from his pack. a thick, dark cloth designed to cover an animal's eyes and head, reducing visual stimulus and calming the nervous system. Getting it onto a conscious, unrestrained Arctic wolf on a narrow cliff ledge without triggering a panic response required him to move in increments so small they were almost imperceptible. He extended his arm toward the wolf, held still, extended further. Alpha flinched once and pulled back, and Noah stopped and waited 2 full minutes before trying again. He extended his arm a third time, slower still, and this time the wolf held his ground. When the cloth finally settled over Alpha's eyes, the wolf went very still. Noah moved fast then. He had 30 seconds, maybe 40, before the animal recovered its bearings and reacted. He got one arm under the wolf's chest and the other around his hindquarters, locked his grip and keyed the radio. Above, the pilot and 2 ground crew began hauling the secondary line. The ascent was slow and vertical. 40 meters, Alpha pressed against Noah's chest, the roar of the water fading as they rose through the mist. When they came over the ridge, lip, and onto solid ground, Noah set the wolf down on the snow and stepped back immediately, giving him space, keeping the cloth over his eyes until Ben was positioned and ready. Ben worked quickly and quietly. His hands moved with the particular efficiency of someone who has done urgent, precise work in cold weather for a very long time. He confirmed the shoulder strain, checked the spine, assessed hydration and core temperature. Mild hypothermia, significant dehydration. The left shoulder would need rest and support, but would heal fully. He set up the IV line and the warming pack and looked up at Noah across the wolf's still body. The hard part was over. The harder part was starting. They moved Alpha to the station's emergency holding facility that afternoon. A heated, low-stimulus enclosure designed for large predator recovery, lined with insulated panels and positioned away from foot traffic. The first 24 hours were the most critical. A wolf under this level of physical and psychological stress could decline rapidly, and there was no way to predict how an animal that had spent its entire life in the open Arctic would respond to close confinement and regular human proximity. Ben checked vitals every 4 hours through the night. Noah slept in the monitoring room on a folding cot, getting up each time Alpha shifted or vocalized. On the first night, the wolf paced the perimeter of the enclosure continuously for 3 hours, then collapsed into a sleep so deep that Noah checked the door twice before he let himself rest. On the second morning, Alpha accepted water from a shallow dish placed near the enclosure wall. He ate nothing, but he drank, which Ben said was the more important sign. His temperature had normalized through the night. The shoulder was responding to rest, and the defensive crouch that had been his default posture since arrival was beginning to release in small, almost unnoticeable ways. On the second night, Noah was sitting with his back against the enclosure wall, reviewing field reports on his tablet, when he noticed Alpha had stopped moving. The wolf was lying on the far side of the space, head up, watching him, not pacing, not vocalizing, just watching with the same steady amber focus that had been there from the beginning, on the cliff, on the rope. In those first uncertain hours in the recovery enclosure, Noah put the tablet down and watched back. They stayed like that for a long time, neither moving, the only sound, the low hum of the heating unit and the wind pressing against the station walls outside. Noah did not move closer. He did not reach through the mesh. He simply stayed where he was, present and still, and let the wolf decide what the distance between them meant. On the third morning, Alpha ate. Ben placed the meat near the wall in the standard way. No eye contact, no lingering, and stepped back. But when he left the room, Alpha crossed the enclosure and ate within 2 meters of where Noah was sitting. Ben caught Noah's eye through the monitoring window and said nothing. There was nothing that needed saying. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that was quiet and careful, and in the way that genuinely important things sometimes are almost ordinary. Ben managed the physical recovery, the shoulder improving steadily, the weight coming back, the coat regaining its full density and brightness. He documented everything with the precision of someone who understood that good records might help the next animal in the same situation. He photographed the shoulder joint every 3 days to track the healing, adjusted the diet as Alpha's weight increased, and kept meticulous notes on behavioral indicators, posture, eye contact, response to proximity, sleep patterns. Noah managed everything else, which mostly meant being present in a way that was consistent and unhurried. He did not try to touch Alpha. He did not try to accelerate anything. He showed up at the same times each day, sat in the same position, and let the wolf set the pace of whatever was developing between them. He had learned over 14 years working in one of the most unforgiving landscapes on the planet that the worst thing you could do with a wild animal, or with anything that mattered, was rush it. Some things opened on their own schedule, or not at all. And the only role available to you was to be there steady and patient when they did. By the end of the second week, Alpha would eat while Noah was in the room, without pausing or repositioning himself. By the end of the third, he would sleep while Noah was there deeply on his side legs, extended in the unguarded posture of an animal that is not anticipating threat. Small things, both of them. The distance between a wild animal and a human being does not close all at once. It closes in increments so gradual you almost miss them. And then one day, you look up and realize it has closed, and you cannot say exactly when. It was on the 31st day that Alpha crossed the enclosure and stood at the mesh close enough that Noah could have reached through and touched his face. He simply stood there. Noah stayed still. The wolf's amber eyes moved across his face with the slow reading attention that had been present from the very first moment on the cliff in the cold air, suspended above a roaring flood. But there was nothing in it now that resembled threat or fear, or the defensive calculation of an injured animal in an unfamiliar space. It was something quieter than any of that, something that had no precise name, but that anyone who has ever sat with a wild animal in a moment of genuine stillness would recognize immediately and without doubt. Ben, watching from the monitoring room, noted the time. He wrote nothing in the log. Some things do not need to be documented to be real. By the 5th week, Alpha's recovery was complete. His shoulder had healed cleanly, bearing full weight without compensation. His body mass had returned to 43 kilograms. His coat was dense and white, and perfect the way it had been before the flood, before the cliff, before any of this. There was no medical reason to keep him any longer, and every biological reason to return him to his territory, before the summer season fully opened and the pack's movements expanded. The release date was set for a Tuesday in late May. Noah spent the night before it sitting in the monitoring room, not reviewing reports, not doing anything in particular. Just sitting with the quiet fact of it that something had come to him broken and afraid and was now whole, and tomorrow it would be gone. And that was exactly how it was supposed to go. He had done releases before, dozens of them, over his career birds and foxes, and once a lynx that had taken 3 weeks to recover from a snare injury. Each time, the moment the animal crossed back into its own world, felt like a small grief and a large relief at once. He expected this one would be no different. He was wrong about that. The morning of the release was clear and cold. The sky a pale gray blue that stretched unbroken to every horizon. The station staff gathered at a respectful distance, far enough not to crowd the moment close enough that they would see it. Ben ran one final check and stepped back. Noah opened the enclosure door and walked 10 meters away and turned around. He stood with his hands at his sides and waited. Alpha appeared in the doorway. He stood at the threshold for a long moment, reading the open air, the wind, the distance, the scent of snow and open tundra, stretching away from the station in every direction. His ears moved forward, then back, then forward again. He turned his head and looked directly at Noah. It lasted 3 seconds. Then he stepped out of the enclosure, crossed the snow at a steady trot, and disappeared over the ridge without looking back. Nobody spoke for a while after that. Carla said later that it felt like watching someone leave for a long journey. Ben said it felt like the right ending. Noah said nothing, which was, for those who knew him, its own kind of answer. The GPS collar transmitted Alpha's location data for the weeks that followed. He moved fast at first 40 kilometers in the first 2 days, pushing north and east toward the territory his pack used in summer. On the 4th day, the signal converged with 6 other movement signatures that the station had been tracking since the flood. The pack was intact, all 7 animals accounted for. Whatever had happened between them in the weeks Alpha was gone, it had not broken the structure of the group or displaced him from his position within it. He was back where he belonged, moving through country he had known his entire life. The collar data came in each morning, and Noah would look at it for a moment before starting his day. A set of coordinates on a map. An animal alive and moving in open country. It was enough. Months passed. Summer came and went, brief and vivid, the tundra green for 6 weeks before the cold returned. The pack denned in the eastern highlands and produced 4 pups, which the collar data and 2 long-range camera captures confirmed by August. Alpha's signals showed him ranging wide, covering the territory, returning to the den site regularly in the pattern of a breeding male with pups to provision. Everything was as it should be. Then, on a night in late October, the camera network caught something unexpected. A motion-triggered unit mounted on the ridge 200 meters behind the station recorded movement at 2:47 in the morning. The footage showed 7 wolves moving through the frame in single file heading northwest along the high ground above the canyon. The lead animal was white. He moved with the unhurried authority of an animal that knew exactly where it was and where it was going. As he passed the camera position, he stopped. He turned his head toward the station lights visible in the valley below, the same pale yellow glow that had been there every night for the past 5 weeks of Alpha's recovery. The same light that had been on in the monitoring room when Noah sat against the enclosure wall and watched and waited and did not hurry anything. He stood there for 11 seconds. Then he turned back to the ridge and resumed his pace, and the pack followed him north into the dark. Noah watched the footage alone at his desk the following morning. He played it twice. The second time, he paused it on the frame where Alpha had stopped and turned toward the station. He looked at it for a long time. Then he closed the laptop and went to start his day. His colleagues noticed he was quieter than usual that morning, and one of them asked if he was all right. He said he was fine. He said the wolves were doing well. He did not say anything else. But the expression on his face was one that nobody who saw it that morning would forget for a long time. Alpha never came back to the station. He didn't need to. He had a pack of territory and 4 pups, learning to run across the same tundra he had crossed his entire life. The world he had been pulled from was still there, unchanged, waiting for him, the way the Arctic waits for everything. Without sentiment, without adjustment, simply present and immense and indifferent to the small dramas played out at its edges. That night on the ridge, 11 seconds a turned head. A pause in the darkness was not a goodbye, and it was not a thank you. It was something wilder and quieter than either of those things. It was a wolf moving through his own world, pausing for a moment at the edge of another one. Noah would go on to work another decade in Nunavut, covering thousands of kilometers of the same highland country, checking camera feeds and tracking collars and responding to whatever the land sent his way. He never spoke much about Alpha to people who asked, not because the story wasn't worth telling, but because the part that mattered most, those 11 seconds on the ridge camera, that pause in the dark, was the kind of thing that tended to lose something in the translation. It was enough to know that somewhere out there on the Arctic plateau, in the dark and the cold and the wide open country, the white wolf was running. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe, because out there in the wild, there are more animals holding on and more people who refuse to walk away.